Well, my name is Fred. Hello, everybody. Um, you know, when I think of like whatever value there is to this study of forgiveness, or why I have studied it, or why anybody studies it, one of the reasons is it's so underutilized and appreciated. I mean, it's a very interesting thing to have an expertise in something that people generally don't want. Um, because and this does relate to having patience, but people like their anger, and people like their, I'm going to say, righteousness and their pissed offness and their, because the anger and the pissed offness provide kind of a scaffolding for them to behave badly. And, you know, the bad behavior, both internal and external, has consequences. And I know that some of you recognize this in terms of physical health. Mm-hmm. But the consequences for emotional health are striking. Because if for whatever parts of us that we haven't forgiven, for whatever parts of our lives now that we haven't made peace with, those usually give us an excuse to be nasty to other people. And it's a very striking kind of permission. Like in the United States now, I mean, you all know enough about what just an awful, contentious culture we have created here, where people feel justified in being cruel to almost anybody. I mean, you know, again, the most obvious being the kids that are being separated, but just the other day, like the president's, you know, spokesperson was kicked out of a restaurant because people didn't like what she was doing. So the grudges that people have, they in some ways create an armoring, a defensiveness, a hostility that people maintain without them fully knowing how much effect they're having, because we so justify them. And when you look, I mean, it's a very interesting thing because it creates a level of antagonism and negativity that follows people without they're fully realizing how much it's following them. Mm-hmm. And so I have found that with intractable things, there's often some hidden pissed offness that people are holding on to very strongly, that they don't, either they don't recognize, they don't consider it a problem, or they don't want to work on it. Yeah. But it has a kind of systemic effect. And the systemic effect, from what I have seen, is very deeply a lack of efficacy. Because when you can't heal yourself from experiences in your own life, it leads to either a subtle bitterness or a subtle sense of hopelessness. I think that's going to show up in medical care. I think that's going to show up in almost anything, because basically an unrequited grudge or grievance, or even just a tribal thing, you know, like here it's right wing versus left wing, it's black versus white, it's everybody. But the inability to make peace with this stuff, the inability to resolve it, leads people with some degree of, I'm going to say, both either helplessness or bitterness, that they can't cope with their own life. They haven't been able to master some part of it, that they can't deal with it, so they usually react with bad behavior. To some degree, that bad behavior may be emotional outbursts, it may be negativity, but it also could be physical stuff. I see people all the time who can't adhere to diets or exercise routines because they already feel ripped off enough from life.
Yeah, I think we all see that as a whole, all of us here.
What's that?
I think we all see that here with our clients.
Yeah.
Physical.
That we're dealing often with this very subtle sense of life ripped me off, that it wasn't fair, that it wasn't honest, and therefore I have to be either extra protective or dismissive or whatever. But I have this subtle sense that it shows up in ways that we don't expect it to show up, the bitterness. And so what I'm presenting is it's an extra emotional, psychological, and even physical burden that people carry with them. It makes them less open to feedback. It makes them less capable of resilience. It makes them more rooted in past habits. It does all sorts of things like that because they don't have a faith that they can simply handle some of the difficult experiences that life has sent their way.
Yeah.
So what we cultivated, and I don't need to talk for that long, but what we cultivated was a simple methodology for helping people forgive. I mean, I remember when we started and what we tried to do, which was, let's simply think of something that affects all people, because everybody's got stuff, can be given to people easily, is not complicated, but gets at the heart of unresolved emotional distress, which is, I really haven't forgiven that this painful thing is on my plate. Or I haven't forgiven my parents for being bad parents. The biggest one that we find all the time, and I would think it would have a dramatic impact on doing any kind of physically based work, would be bad relationships that people haven't forgiven and aren't forgiving. The cost of a bad marriage, a failed partnership, a cheating something or other, can fill somebody with resentment and bitterness that's going to influence everything they do. And I'm just cautious that these kind of understandings are not a little more on people's mental maps.
And in the medical world, it's not even considered, is it?
I mean, not usually.
Usually.
Yeah. But you all know that when you hold tension, when you are stressed because you don't feel in control of things, when your breathing constricts, that all of the body's ability to rehabilitate itself is compromised. So let me just review the simple strategies that are general mental health strategies because they're useful for anything. But the simple strategies that we recognized which make people more forgiving are, one, and this is so obvious to me, but it still strikes other people as not so obvious, is the simple qualities of awe and gratitude. that in our work, we are ferocious promoters of seeing the good in life.
Yeah.
And that is, I can see, the easiest antidote to not being able to handle the crap in life. I have this unwavering belief that every single person who does any kind of trying to help other people should ask not just what's wrong with you, but what's right with you.
Absolutely.
Mm.
That even if it does nothing more than give people an opportunity to think about what's working well,
Mhm.
that in and of itself makes them more responsive to communication and listening, and gives them a very different sense of efficacy about life. But the cultivation of what's going well for you is, to me, one of the underutilized medical interventions,
Mm.
because you don't have to make anything up. I mean, it's not like, so hey, you have to tell me, like, you didn't win the lottery, fine, but did you have enough resources so you had food this morning? That's a good thing. Do your legs still work? Okay, one day they won't. So this is also good. Does anybody love you? Well, that's nice. But these kind of promptings almost always allow people to have a wider lens with which to hold the difficulties they're facing. Because all difficulties cause an adrenalized response to life, which narrows our attention, which I imagine for any of you who are medical practitioners, that's what you get, is stressed people overly focused on their problems. I get the same thing when I deal with people's emotional issues. They don't walk in telling me, I have a job, I woke up in a bed, I had running water and food, I had transportation, I had an education, my kids are in a safe school. Okay, life is good and this sucked.
Mm.
That's a more accurate appraisal of their life than just walking in and saying this sucks. I think the same is universal. I mean, unless obviously somebody's coming in with a knife in their heart, then there is nothing good going on. But separate from that, or in a crisis, I'm not trying to be glib,
Yeah.
but we underestimate the coping capacity of positiveness. And but of a realistic positiveness, which is completely different than the BS of everything's going to get better, which is very often BS. The truth is, some things get better, some things get worse. That life is unpredictable, but even within physical difficulties, there's still a tremendous amount that goes well, and the research on people who are resilient shows that they handle tremendous difficulties and they still have a good quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
So what we found was in teaching or educating about forgiveness, we would ask people, well, what's working? Or has anybody been kind to you today? Or have you, recognized your startling material abundance if you live here in Silicon Valley and, you have more tchotchkes and things to fool around with than most people can throw out, you know what I mean? And here you are just complaining because your parents didn't love you enough, or your ex was a bum, or your stomach hurts. And I'm not talking about overwhelming difficulty. I'm talking about normal life stuff. It's a framing.
Yeah.
And the minute you change that framing a little bit, every human being breathes a little more deeply. So one of the other things we would do, unless somebody was in, I mean, we dealt with people who had family members murdered. So if the murder was proximate, you know, it was like 3 months, we're not going to ask them as strongly, so what's working for you? You know, it's like that joke about Abraham Lincoln's wife. So after, you know, after he's shot, somebody goes up to her and says, so besides that, Mrs. Lincoln, how'd you like the play? You know, and it's like we are. Like, I'm not talking about denial or obnoxiousness. But even people we worked with who had their children murdered, 2 years out, we didn't let them just talk about it. Because that gives them, and it reinforces such a distorted perception of life. And that distorted perception makes it much harder for them to take care of themselves. Because that distorted perception is all about helplessness and a kind of self-pity and a stress-based response. So what forgiveness starts at some level with seeing things in perspective.
Yeah.
But it doesn't minimize the danger or damage. So it's not, and by the way, Mrs. Lincoln, how'd you like the play? It's, you know, 2 years later, somebody could say, and we do this depending on the intensity, when we ask people to talk about what's wrong, we sometimes ask them to tack on to the end of their conversation something they're thankful for. So that their nervous system doesn't have so much disorganization and stress, and they're not re-traumatizing themselves by the telling all the time.
Right.
So the one of the parts in forgiveness is like an active understanding that life has very difficult experiences and very beautiful experiences. And there is no life without both. And part of the ability to be resilient and handle difficulties comes with recognizing they come as a package. Not always, you know, one-to-one correspondence, but if you just walk in and say, my stomach hurts, and you're 73, and you don't give some positive affirmation by the fact that this is maybe the first real difficulty that you have, then you're going to be holding things in a way that's going to make every ounce of your suffering worse. And it's going to make it so much harder to remediate because of the way you're holding it. So it's not minimization, it's not denial, it's not suppression. It's a little wider perspective, which limits the amount of adrenaline overload in the brain, which allows us to listen and see things more clearly. I mean, that's the purpose of it. But it also gives people the chance to enjoy their life, even within things that are difficult, which is important. So the first part of forgiveness is like, thank you. And it's an opening up to the fact that, I mean, unless you've been unfortunately the victim of something truly horrendous, which is rare, most other things are part of normal life. and that there are useful antidotes for most of them, not all of them, but most of them. The second piece of forgiveness is the stress management piece. And, you know, when I worked at Stanford's hospital, this was the central piece to that I could see for anything. I don't see how a patient that isn't asked to quiet down a little bit can give a full accounting of their life, can hear what's needed to be said. I mean, you know, that's why people come in with friends and family, so they're not as overwhelmed. But some kind of stress management practice so that they are not just operating on overload helps processing everything. But for forgiveness, we teach it as a counter conditioning strategy. So what that means is, and you can see this in any physical condition as well, is that people rehearse 100 times a day how awful their life is. Having nothing to do with whether that's helpful, but they rehearse 100 times a day. I'm in pain, I hate this, this is wrong, why me? Whatever it is, I hate, my doctor's an idiot, whatever it is. But they're rehearsing negative patterning, and they're rehearsing things that condition the stress response. So what stress management does, it can counter condition some of that. So that every time you think of the difficult experience, you don't have to get so aroused. We do this with mostly emotional experience, but sometimes with physical. You know, that if somebody is the victim of a hit and run driver or a medical mistake, there's all sorts of forgiveness needed. But the relentless anger that is self-triggered by like this rumination on how bad it is and how unfair it is and how difficult it is, creates a situation where, you know, that because of the conditioning, the negativity emerges almost instantly, even in situations that it has nothing to do with, which is what happened with any conditioned response. And so we literally try to remind people that you have a conditioned response and you want to, you know, decondition that. You want to extinguish some of the negativity around the situation, mostly so you can make better decisions about it. The third thing, I mean, these were just the simplest mental health strategies that we could come up with. And at the time I was working in behavioral medicine at Stanford's medical school. The third one is, and I think this applies to everybody too, is we try to get them to switch their story out of victim mode. So we actively worked on constructing different stories. And the major point of intervention we had was Dr. Phil's, so how's that working for you?
Right.
That was our strongest intervention.
That's a good thing to say.
You know,
I like that.
what's that?
That's a good thing to say, to ask people, isn't it?
Yeah, how's that working for you? So we would ask people who had told themselves 400 times a day or told other people how terrible it was that they had arthritis or whatever it is. How's it working for you to complain that much? Like, is that making you feel better? Is that helping your physical condition? Is that eliminating as an object of obsession?
Yeah.
The truth, unfortunately, is, and you all know this, that except for really massive physical pain, the framing of it has a big influence on how limiting it is to our life. That if we tell the story of a survivor rather than a victim, or if we tell the story of what we're doing to make it better, rather than just how difficult it is to cope with, that framing in and of itself changes our perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
But it is to me very helpful with anybody stuck on anything, is to remind them that they have some bandwidth on what story they tell, how often, and to whom.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you all would know this, but I remember reading, because this was one of the things that influenced me, that just getting people to shut up about some of their medical conditions makes their difficulties less. But I'm not just talking about like shutting up. I'm talking about the conscious reframing of things.
Yeah.
The reminder that they have some latitude in how it is that they talk about it. So I've worked with people who have had really awful things happen to them. And while there's no way to make that okay, what you can do is just a little reminder for a guy, let's say, who suffered an industrial accident and lost his job and is driving his wife absolutely batty. But and you can't force anything, but when, let's say, the man's suffering gets intense enough, there can be a reminder that, hey, you want to pay attention to this woman here, that she's helping you. And you're going to have an easier time of this if that woman is part of your story. That one, you had a terrible accident, two, you're in pain, and three, you were gifted with a loyal partner. And it seems pretty stupid to just talk about the negative sides and not highlight the positive as well, because there are a lot of people who do not have a partner this good.
Mm.
You can tell me there's a lot of people who didn't suffer the way you did, and I'll agree with you. And then I'll tell you right back that there are a lot of people who don't have this kind of loving partner. It seems really self-destructive from my point of view that you focus so much on the negative, but don't hardly talk about the gift that this partner is for you. That just seems self-destructive to me. So there are ways, again, forgiveness, which means, yes, I had this awful accident. I'm hurt. It's terrible. And somehow I was lucky enough to have this person by my side, or parents who are supportive, or medical care that tries. Whatever it is, it allows a more nuanced story that doesn't flood the body with catecholamines all day long.
Mm.
But it also frames the whole perspective on it. The framing is different in the mind. When you wake up in the morning, what do you tell yourself? Do you tell yourself, just poor me, or something forward-looking? So the third piece that again forms the basis of our forgiveness is changing the story somewhat out of the victim mode. And the last part of what we oriented towards forgiveness and have used very successfully with people from all over, almost any kind of thing you can imagine, is some very simple cognitive disputation. And the very simple cognitive disputation, there's a couple of very useful theories on cognitive disputation. There's Albert Ellis's rational emotive. There's David Burns', cognitive disputation. But I can't teach that to people that quickly. The one hook that we have used for cognitive disputation is, and this is that people who suffer more because they try to insist that the way life turned out was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that causes so much extra pain. And that is an illusion or a distortion of reality, because the way it is has to be right. I mean, it's just the way it is. And people drive themselves crazy fighting reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the last part of the forgiveness education is you're almost always going to lose when you fight City Hall. And City Hall is small compared to fighting reality. And the key to it hinges on, and this is where the cognitive disputation piece comes in, is just because you wanted something to happen in a certain way, it doesn't mean it had to happen that way. And that's the process by which people begin to accept their lives.
Mm-hmm.
That yes, I could have wanted a better spouse, I could have wanted better parents, I could have wanted a healthier body, all that's true. But just because I wanted it doesn't mean that I had to have it.
Mm-hmm.
And when people are furious about anything more than just really short term, it's because they're confusing wanting something with having to have it, which is the essence of cognitive disputation.
And I think you talk about that so beautifully in your book.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to lay out the 4 key qualities that we found that can help for people make more peace and be more resilient within the midst of suffering. So they are being more thankful and grateful and in awe of their life. Really changing the story that they tell, practicing stress management when they're upset. We teach them to take a couple of deep breaths and picture someone they love whenever they're bent out of shape, just to chill.
Yeah.
And last, we remind them literally that, like what I've told many people, like the famous Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want. But those 4 incredibly simple, readily available mental and physical health strategies, they nudge people to forgiveness. Because we have done this work through many, both hellish places and places where you'd be shocked that people are as pissed off as they are, but people seem to be able to upset themselves over almost anything. So that's I just wanted to give you an overview of pragmatic way that we see forgiveness.
It's fantastic, Fred. Thank you so much. And it works, as everybody here will know, it just dovetails beautifully with the work that we do, because although we predominantly treat physical conditions, we treat them as emotionally induced conditions. So we're working with the stress, we're working with forgiveness, reframing. So this is perfect.
But you all know, I mean, I see it, that people's way of handling the things that happen to them, including physical difficulty, has a profound effect on both their experience of suffering and the chronicity of some of the physical difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if we're working with anybody with a physical condition anyway, we're always going to be working with the emotional side, whether that's because of the chronic pain they present with, or the past traumas that we're also helping them to process. Because obviously we're talking about adverse childhood experiences and any other traumas that they've had in their life that we're linking with their physical pain. But I wonder if any of the others, do any of you have any questions you'd like to ask Fred while he's here?
You know, let me just say one more thing. One of the ways that I thought medicine, so to speak, could have, I mean, helped itself in just its framing from, maybe not from the beginning because it was so primitive, but now that we know a bit more about things, that we're all not taught to be grateful for when our bodies do work is a tremendous missed opportunity for both everybody's happiness, but I believe the fullest functioning of these bodies, and also reminded relentlessly that our bodies are meant to deteriorate and decay. that it's not a mistake picking on somebody, you know, that their body falls apart. And I remember, I mean, I'm from New York, so there is a inherent sarcasm to my way of holding things. But I remember I was at some forgiveness thing, and somebody was talking about, I think, but I can't remember, about some bad care. You know, I'm very fuzzy on this, that one of her parents may have received at a hospital. But she said something about, like, her dad, I think, was 81, and she was shocked that he had a heart attack. And I'm thinking the only way to be shocked that an 81-year-old has a heart attack is to never have looked at anything. I mean, you know, 81, you've lived a long time. Things happen.
Yeah.
You know, we're something, this incredibly brilliant mechanism that wears out.
True.
So, but both of those framings would help everybody in the system be more forgiving. If they were grateful for every experience of health and opportunity they had, you know, you're better, wonderful, this is great, because it won't last. No, I'm serious. I mean, this is the only truthful approach to medical care, right? That you're better, great, enjoy it, love it, appreciate it. Like you have a, you know, like in cancer care, you have a remission is all you get, actually, because something's going to kill you. But if that intelligence could pervade the system with a profound appreciation for what works when it works, there would be so much more forgiveness every inch of it, because one, it's not going to last. And two, what a blessing it is when it does exist. So that everybody would be handling it more maturely.
Yeah. Good point.
You know? What did you expect from an 81-year-old guy? You know, that he was like, he was going to just go on forever? But this same quality exists for people in other aspects of life with forgiveness, but they don't want to recognize what a challenge life is.
Yeah.
They want the fantasy of it's going to be easy. And it's not easy. And keeping health is not easy. You know, it takes a combination of luck and good genetics and good habits and then luck. You know what I mean? It's like, and God bless, we definitely up the odds by good habits.
Yeah, definitely.
But we don't have any guarantees.
True, true. But does anybody have any questions?
Hi. I just wondered, could you expand a little bit more on the second point that you made about stress management practice?
Sure.
Where people are rehearsing there 100 times a day. It's not fair. I hate you, someone, whatever.
Is the guy behind you with the hat one of your successful outcomes?
He's one of the decayed ones, yeah. Yeah. He admitted he was decaying. And he just went with it. That's Stanley, yeah.
Whenever the human nervous system detects a threat, it releases adrenaline and cortisol, but adrenaline to start, cortisol if it's a longer problem. But very quickly, the nervous system wants to automate threat if it's either repetitive or really bad. You know, so if it's really bad, it's one trial learning. You know, you put your hand on a stove, one trial learning. You don't need 5 reminders that you don't go near a stove. So you feel scared anytime near the stove. But with smaller things, it takes some repetition. But because the nervous system wants to like standardize and regulate threat, when something is perceived by the mind as dangerous, the nervous system doesn't want to analyze it for too long. You know, the brain wants to say, okay, this is a threat. So, you know, white coat hypertension, probably the simplest example of that, right? You know, that the people perceive the doctor's office as threatening. And it is. I mean, that's not a misperception. But what I'm getting at is it does that with everything. So with forgiveness, what you're dealing with, both either in physical threats or emotional threats, you're dealing with a pattern that's been set by the nervous system to not be surprised and recognize that, oh, when mom comes home, it's not going to be good. Or when I have to take my pill, I'm going to feel shitty, or anything. So it adrenalizes even before the experience happens. So when you get somebody who has any kind of repetitive threat at all, they're going to have a patterning that is outside of their conscious awareness, and they might not be able to listen to good responses. They may be agitated even before anything happens, or the agitation may become a problem. Like I'm scared, so I can't do this, or I'm angry. So in order to forgive or to be open to new experience, which is pretty much the same, you have to quiet down that stress response so that people are then now seeing the experience with fresh eyes, not just the nervous system's patterning of threat. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, I mean, one of the things you said was to do the deep breathing and think of someone that you love. So that's a way of calming.
That's what we
stress
do.
response. Yeah.
But the deep breathing thing, that's one of those things that can be challenging to teach because most people can't deep breathe. So they don't actually breathe deeply enough for that parasympathetic part to go, okay, everything's cool. You actually have to relax your lower abdomen and expand your lower abdomen with the chest not too tight. That's real deep breathing, but many people can't do it.
Is that because they've forgotten? They've unlearned that?
They've unlearned it. And two reasons. One, most of us suck in our belly for a vanity. So we limit the amount of breathing we can do because of that. We suck it in because of fear. The nervous system doesn't care what you're afraid of. So vanity is a form of fear. So you have to, if you're working on somebody to just get them to relax, what I have found is the most important place to begin is have them move their shoulders around a little bit and pull back on their shoulders so their chest opens and raise their shoulders, because that will release the diaphragm. Then when the diaphragm is released a little, people get fatter. They don't like that.
Yeah.
So you have to address that directly, which is it's okay to have a belly. And what you want is you want to breathe so that that belly gets even bigger, because that's the place that was set for the body to open up to welcome in air. You breathe. It takes about 2 or 3 breaths like that before the nervous system recognizes, because you can't really breathe like that if you're actually endangered. You can only relax your abdomen if you're not in any real danger. So the nervous system recognizes that, and then it says, okay, I'm willing to shift a little bit into more parasympathetic. And then you can bring an image of something positive to your mind, and in that synergistically furthers the sense of safety, so that a person will then take a really deep breath, go, and then they're beginning, like they're back to, I can go in either direction. If they get stressed again because of something they hear or something you say or something they're worried about, you can relax them again, because they won't hear very much in threat mode. And it makes, as you all know, makes the symptoms of pain worse, because the threat comes in both physically and emotionally, and after a while, some of those pathways blend. But it's also good to remind people that they can counter condition some of that. You can't counter condition all of it. You can counter condition some. You can remind people to relax their belly, take a couple of breaths when you feel anxious. You can do the same when you have a passing physical sensation too. Just let it go. You can't do that unless you're fully relaxed. It's very hard. It's not that you can't, it's just hard. So you're kind of cooperating with this forgiveness of letting the disturbance go. Does that help?
It does, yes. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Anybody else got any questions before we have to let Fred go because he's got to get off this day? Any other questions? No? I think this has just been so helpful, Fred, because it just reinforces everything we do. It's dovetailing with the work, tailing with the work we do. Your book, as I said, I recommend this to every single patient that I see because it's relevant to every single patient that I see. And it just saves me time as well, having to explain everything. So thank you. So if any of you haven't read, have you all read Dr. Luskin's book? Yep. Forgive, forget. Yeah, forgive for good. It's excellent. And Kana, is it in Spanish yet? Fred, is it in
No,
Spanish yet?
it's not in Spanish. I wish it would be in Spanish. I have read the one that is written by a priest, a German priest about forgiveness that is very famous here in Spain.
Okay, but we need Fred's book in Spanish then, by the sounds of it, Fred.
We need it, absolutely.
We're trying to raise awareness in Spain and help them in Spain to work with this. So forgiveness, this book particularly would be wonderful, wouldn't it?
You know, as or more useful than the book I wrote, Stanford and other places that I teach have put numerous YouTube videos of me talking about forgiveness up. And, you know, I have nothing to do with them. I'm just saying that in particular, Stanford and UC Berkeley and some places, if you just YouTube my name, there's lots of videos that explain forgiveness, that talk about what it is and what it isn't. I mean, you know, maybe not that different than I just did with you, but in a much more public kind of way. And many people I know who do work in this world have referred some of their clients to the video. You know, that because the greater good people of Berkeley have cut the videos into like maybe 7 or 5 minute segments, and you know that's what people have time for. But you know, there's a good number of them that demystify forgiveness, which is really what the work that we've tried to do over these 20-something years. Just like you saw the way I talk to you. I mean, I teach forgiveness all over the place, but we try to make it as non-woo-woo and as like just as normal as anything.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's quiet your breathing out, tell a different story. I mean, anybody can do that. It works. It does work, but we don't want it to be mysterious.
Mm.
It's practice like anything else of value. You know, you have to work at it, but it's simple skills.
Absolutely. And I think it's very simply put and very practical, both the book and the videos. So yes, thank you for mentioning the videos, because those are always useful to recommend to patients.
Yeah, you don't get better at anything without practice.
No? Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the really bad news things of this world, you know? You don't get healthy without practice, you don't feel better without practice, I mean, there's no free lunch in that way.
Deep breathing is a lot easier to do than going for a run or going to the gym. So what excuse is there not to do it?
Exactly. So does anybody else have a thought? Otherwise, I have to go to another meeting.
No,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And yeah, be fantastic. And as I said, this has been recorded, and we will be able to let all the other members see it, and also any future members. So we will continue to recommend your book. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.